Uh, before we have this colloquy, let me tell you, and you can edit it out later if you like, that my feelings about the bicentennial are predicated on my philosophy that I've developed over the lifetime, that human beings stand adversity very well, but they can't stand prosperity. There's a story to the effect that Plato, when he became famous in Athens as a philosopher, was asked to go to some city on the north coast of Africa, which was in trouble, deep trouble, political and economic trouble, to administer a new code of laws to the city. And he refused to go, saying, "I cannot legislate for any people in prosperity." Now, what has happened to this country, and you can cut this out if you like, what has happened to this country will happen to any country that develops a large degree of prosperity. I give you that merely because everything probably that I could say about my feelings on the bicentennial are predicated on that philosophy. If I'm right about the mess that we're in economically today, it's the result of prosperity, of a long period where people wanted more and more of everything. To a certain extent, our wonderful technological production warranted an increase in the things that people might have. But obviously we went quite beyond that. And a change has taken place in people's attitude, for instance, toward death. Our ancestors 200 years ago were afraid of death, but gradually it developed into what we call credit, which remained debt just the same, but assumed to be something in itself. That is to say, you could use debt as a plus factor in production and consumption. That changed things very much. The old-time banker in this country warned those who came to him to borrow money. He warned them against borrowing unless they were quite sure that they could pay it off. Now, you see, the banks advertise, people come and borrow, come and borrow. This extension, this overextension of credit, it seems to me, which is a thing which has taken place in my lifetime, has a great deal to do with the situation we're in. I should say that the principal object of a celebration of a 200th anniversary would be to discover what has brought us into that situation. How did the people of 200 years ago, how did they live? How did they act? What were their motives? What were their beliefs? Is there anything in the difference that now exists between the life of today and then that would explain why we are at this present juncture? Suppose you'd asked me the question, if I had autocratic power, I could do just exactly what I wanted to do and make other people do what I wanted them to do. How would I exercise it? And I would probably reply, I wouldn't exercise it at all. I wouldn't take the responsibility. Now, 3 or 4 years ago, when there was when they were marching on, the young people were marching on Washington, or preventing anybody from coming into Washington, I thought it was a fine rebellion. I couldn't see much point in burning down libraries, but I thought it was a wonderful opportunity. The young people that I personally know, who were all for a great change, have either disappeared or frankly said they'd take their chance with the establishment. For the most part, and why has this happened? Because they had no leadership. They had no Jesus. What the country needed at that time was a modern Jesus, but none appeared. And so I was trying to promote. At that time, I was talking a good deal out at Mather in Harpers Ferry to the classes that came into Ray Nelson. I was saying a great many things that shocked the boys that came in from the field. They were beginning to think that I had a younger view than even some of the hippies. I did see a great opportunity, but for lack of leadership and for lack of one central idea, it seems to have gone down the drain. One day out at Harpers Ferry, we were discussing the matter of self-interest. What is self-interest? Is it something essential and intrinsic in the human being, or is it something to be deplored? My feeling is that probably every human act is based on self-interest. But what is, then the question is, what is really for the true interest of the individual? One of the German philosophers, Kant, said something to this effect. I think this is a good rendering of what he really said in German. conduct yourself in such a way that if everyone else conducted themselves in the same way, you would benefit thereby. Now, you see that's a very different thing from what we call the golden rule. It implies self-interest on the part of the individual. The golden rule expresses a far more generous view. But if Kant were right about that, then the only out that I can see is for each person to have a higher notion of what constitutes true self-interest. Obviously, or it's obvious to me, I'd say, we've gone wrong on that point, which would account for our political and economic difficulties. We've been following a course of false self-interest. I think the young people 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, as I said, had a glimpse of that. They said they went too far. They said everything is wrong. We should throw it overboard. But the very fact that they were thinking was the saving grace. I still think the answers have to come from the younger group of people. I have no faith in the middle-aged or elderly people doing anything about it. I still think that youth movement, as it was called, was right and sound. Maybe it'll come back again. But it won't come back as a result of parading or celebrating in the sense of telling what wonderful people we are. We are not wonderful people. We do distressing things. This is not the well, I'd put it this way. We are not necessarily the greatest people that ever existed on this earth. I would hate to see any sort of bicentennial celebration that even intimated that we thought we were. We've broken down. We have to rebuild. On what are we going to rebuild? On more and more prosperity? No, we're going to rebuild on the basis of adversity, whether you like it or not. Are we going to have more and more of everything? No. For a long period now, we're going to have less and less of everything. We're going to be more like the people who existed on this continent, the white people on this continent 200 years ago. Stop and think. Was the very fact that they had to struggle so hard the origin of all the merits they developed? Is it good not to struggle? Those are the things that, with difficulty, I know, with difficulty, those are the things that the historical side of the National Park Service can get people to think about. It's not easy. It's not easy because you're up against the fact that people don't really want to think. But now, the one hope is that we're getting into a situation where whether they like it or not, they've got to think. That's our opportunity now, to find a device, any device, in which we can promote these thoughts that I and so many others have. When I first became acquainted with the workings of the National Park Service, and we were beginning to talk about interpretation, a great many people said, don't use the word education. People don't come to the national parks to be educated. And they resent, the adults who come to the parks resent the idea that they need any education. As time went on, more and more we began to permit ourselves to take the role of educators. Interpretation is, at best, of course, in the parks, hopefully a pleasurable form of outdoor education. Now, what can we do in that respect? You know the difficulties. Everybody connected with the Park Service knows the difficulties of this educational hope that we have. You can't preach to people in the parks. They don't like it. The most you can do is get them to thinking for themselves, planting the seeds. The thing that people, the thing that I would like as an interpreter, I would like to suggest to people right now, and not through parades or reduplicating the uniforms of the military and that sort of thing, is somehow to suggest to them that we have gone far, but not always in the right direction. To look back over our history, and not only look back, but feel back into our history, and decide what things we have done which are of permanent value, and where we have gone wrong. Now, if you can do that, it's of vastly more importance than to parade and celebrate, isn't it? Now, it's going to be a difficult thing to do, because the hardest task, Emerson said that the hardest task that human beings have is to think. And there are occasions when it's not only difficult to think, but actually painful. There hasn't been a moment in the past 200 years in this country where it was more painful to think than it is today. But unless people think, we're sunk. It seems to me obvious. So, difficult as it may be, the one thing of importance that the National Park Service is, can do for people is, by adopting any method possible, to get people to compare, to think. wherever you are in the United States, the differences that exist now in the life that we're living. Compare. Were our ancestors right? Were they wrong? In certain things that they did. That was I'm saying things that I know perfectly well are extremely difficult to do, but I merely say that more important than parades, you have people who come to the Park Service. You have at least occasionally you have captive audiences. You have a far better chance to get people to think than any other medium that you can think of. I should say that, and it's not true just at the moment, but I think it always has been true since we began trying to do what we call interpretation. I think it's a vital moment. I think the opportunity right now is the best, in this respect that I refer to, is the best that the National Park Service, the best opportunity the Park Service has ever had. This is a crisis. The greatest crisis, maybe, that the country has ever had. Democracy is under test. We're now to find out whether it's workable with a people of 200-odd million people, as it was when we had a straggling of people along the Atlantic coast. Will it work? Will it work with such a vast number of people? We don't know, because it's never happened before in the world. I think people, though they find it difficult and painful to think now, I still believe they will think. I don't know of any better opportunity, any better provocation for thinking than the Park Service with its historical areas, particularly because we're in the field of history here rather than in the field of nature. If we can't do it, I don't know who can. Although this is a historical celebration, it's obvious that every single area in the Park Service, and I would even include the recreational areas, can do something. But I question whether the natural areas, the scenic and natural areas, should make any attempt to plunge into what is a historical matter. The natural areas, it seemed to me, should go on doing better those things that they have been doing. Because one of the essentials is that people do not yet feel their kinship with nature. Many of the alarming things that we're doing at the present time are based on the fact that people do not yet know that they are at one with the land. And if they go on doing their job, they can do far more than as though they tried to plunge into any historical interpretation. That's my feeling about it.